Thanks for joining us on Not Boring CEs, where we don't think you should be bored to death while getting your continuing ed. Keep listening here, then hop over to notboringces.com to get all your online CE credits. All right, y'all, let's get to learning. Ann Miller is a perinatal mental health certified PMH-C therapist with more than 20 years of experience as a licensed social worker and over 5 years devoted exclusively to perinatal and women's mental health. She specializes in supporting individuals experiencing postpartum mood and anxiety disorders, birth trauma, reproductive loss, and the many emotional transitions that accompany parenthood. Ann's therapeutic work integrates EMDR, CBT, ACT, and trauma-informed care, offering clients a compassionate, evidence-based space to heal and grow. Ann's clinical practice is deeply informed by her own lived experience as a mother of three who has personally navigated postpartum anxiety. This perspective allows her to offer an uncommon level of empathy, validation, and understanding to the clients she serves. She recognizes how overwhelming and isolating the postpartum period can be and is committed to helping women feel seen, supported, and empowered through every step of their healing journey. As the founder and clinical director of Ampersand Therapy Collective, Ann leads a group practice dedicated to perinatal mental health and women's well-being across the lifespan. Whether clients are coping with perinatal depression or anxiety, processing a traumatic birth, adjusting to new parenthood, or moving through grief or identity transitions, Ann brings warmth, clinical experience, and a steady, grounding presence to her work. She's committed to helping women reconnect with themselves, restore their sense of balance, and feel more prepared, understood, and empowered.
All right.
Welcome back to Not Boring CEs. I'm here today with Ann Miller. We are going to be talking about perinatal and postpartum mental health conditions. This is something that I know it's like near and dear to my heart as a postpartum depression survivor and someone who has had like no training at all in my career on it. So I knew when I was going through it, I couldn't just find a generalist and trust that they knew what they were talking about because I didn't know what I was talking about. So I'm super grateful for folks like Anne who specialize. So thanks for being here first, Anne. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yay. So let's go super like bare bones. Can we talk about like what are perinatal and postpartum mental health conditions? Like lay it out for us like we're five.
Sure. Well, perinatal refers to the onset of conditions in the time period from conception to about a year, 18 months after birth. And it takes into consideration fluctuations in hormones from pregnancy, post-birth, lactation, weaning, and the restart of menstruation. So it's referring to a time period in a woman's life. Um, Also, I would mention that we consider loss or I would also mention that we would consider loss within this time period. So
Got it.
it's not just birth, it's also women who lose a birth or a little one in this time period. So.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me that it goes to a year postpartum. It makes sense to me having given birth that it goes to a year postpartum. But I think it's often women who have 11 month olds wouldn't consider themselves like in the same category as they might have 3 weeks out, right? Like
You know,
hormonally we're still a mess. But there's
we say a year is, I think, the official diagnosis, but those of us who practice in the postpartum perinatal space, we get really liberal with this definition. We are talking about the postpartum perinatal definition a year, 2 years out.
Mhm.
And if someone wants to start defining the postpartum experience multiple years out, we're not going to stop them because
Right.
it continues. So
Yeah.
but strictly speaking, yes, a year, 18 months.
Okay.
It's an experience. So,
Yeah, it is an experience there
yes, it is.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
How common is like a perinatal mood disorder or Like how often does that happen?
Yeah, so the mood disorder part refers to um, the mood, right? So we call it PMADS. And so I think commonly
Right.
people would refer to postpartum depression, right? And so when I had my first kiddo 20 years ago, I only ever heard the word postpartum depression.
Hmm.
Now we would use the word PMADS, postpartum mood and anxiety disorders, okay?
Hmm.
So postpartum or perinatal refers to that time period. Mood refers to depression, bipolar, psychosis. Anxiety would be generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, OCD, PTSD. And then disorder is what we know as therapists and those of us working in the mental health field, anything that is getting in the way of daily living, right? Our activities of daily living and making life hard. Okay.
Hmm.
So that's the full definition of PMADS,
Hmm.
postpartum or perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. And when we think about that definition, we're talking about 1 in 7 women and 1 in 10 men. So it's really
Hmm.
common, a lot more common than we think.
Yeah. And can we pause for a minute and talk about men? Because I feel like I've had a student who specialized in like postpartum men. And initially I was like, what, huh? Like, sure, I can help you with that. But it was a niche I hadn't heard of before. And it wasn't one I'd
Yeah.
ever considered.
Yeah, yeah, it's an important one because it's correlated the depression of men. And when I should stop here and say that when we were talking about postpartum men, I use that term inclusively to refer to our non-birthing partners. So
Mhm.
um, certainly it's not just men, but also you know women who are the non-birthing partner in a relationship. And men, we know that they also experience hormonal shifts. They have decreased testosterone, increased cortisol and estradiol, vasopressin, prolactin, and oxytocin. We also know that men are traditionally less likely to seek mental health support.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's important that they know that they can get support as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Anecdotally, or if you happen to know the research, do you see an increased risk of like postpartum depression in men, for instance, if their partner if also has it? Like, is there
Yes,
increased risk? Okay,
there is.
makes sense.
Yes, we do know that those two things are correlated,
Hmm.
and the other way around as well.
Yeah.
Oh,
And it makes sense, right? Everybody's exhausted, everybody's hormones are all over the place, and then you're not able to like support one another in the way you might have before because of that. And because you've got this brand new, beautiful little responsibility that is like upended your life. That's interesting.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it correlates for negative outcomes for mom, for dad, and for the little one. So
Hmm.
the importance of getting help is imperative for everyone involved, mom,
Hmm.
dad, or the non-birthing partner, and for that little one.
Yeah. So we're learning it's a lot more common than we think. It's not
Hmm.
just whoever gave birth.
Nope.
Um, I like that because I know when I gave birth, when did I give birth? Am I still
Mhm.
postpartum with this brain? This is perimenopause brain. It's different. Um, when I gave birth, I guess almost 13 years ago. Um, it's interesting how I had only heard of postpartum depression as well. And
Mhm.
since then have talked to a number of therapists and friends who have experienced or who treat postpartum anxiety. Um, and had a really good friend who had postpartum psychosis, which is a really terrifying experience.
Yes, it is. Yes,
Yeah.
it is. Yeah. Yeah, when I had my first, I didn't get caught in the screens because the screeners asked questions about postpartum depression, and I was not depressed. I was anxious.
Hmm.
Um, and, I very much specialize in postpartum anxiety,
Hmm.
which I think is very common and something that a lot of women can identify with. Um, but intrusive thoughts are something that I'd love to talk about.
Yeah.
Certainly, we know that. postpartum and perinatal mood and anxiety disorders are a broad spectrum of things that are important for therapists and mental health practitioners to know about because they identify in so many different ways.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm thinking too about the differences in parenting, like
Mhm.
different parenting expectations over the generations. Like as
Mhm.
I was a child of the 80s, right? And it was kind of like, here's the television, there's the outside. Go for it. Whereas like my generation of parents, no television until they were two, and you're always on the floor playing with them constantly. And there's just so much information coming at you all the time about parenting and
Mhm.
how that can, for those of us who are anxiously wired, that can really lead us to feel like we're doing it wrong and have a lot
Mhm.
of like mom guilt and those kinds of things that make maybe predispose us a little bit more than previous generations to
Mhm.
that anxiety. But
Mhm.
also, hopefully, like our generation has partners that are maybe more involved than some of the other generations before us, which might help alleviate. I don't know. What
Mhm.
do you see anecdotally with your folks?
Anecdotally, I am so fascinated and excited to see what this next generation of kiddos is like because millennials are doing the work.
Hmm.
And I cannot tell you how many parents are in therapy right now trying to break generational cycles
Yeah.
and trying to be better parents than their parents before them. And
Hmm.
so they are coming in trying to fix the postpartum anxiety, trying to address things that are coming up for them because as new parents, they're realizing that they want to do things differently. And
Hmm.
so they are, I think, millennials and Gen Z and the young parents that I'm seeing in therapy are coming in saying they recognize that they're experiencing parenting and being new parents differently, and it's hard and stressful and they want to do it right. And so
Hmm.
they are going to address all the things that they haven't addressed yet. And they want to make sure that they're setting their children up to be um, good humans and capable of taking on the world in a way that is uh, uh, they're going to have skills with their they're going to have social skills and social emotional skills,
Hmm.
which is
It's
so
interesting. There's just so much like push pull with
fun.
each.
Hmm.
Like I
Hmm.
feel like it's so important that the kids of today learn those social skills because social media and their phones take them away,
Yes.
right? Like
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
it's such an interesting dynamic. Whereas like we just run around with the neighborhood kids all day,
Yes.
and somebody would hurt our feelings and it just was managed differently.
Yes.
Um, and I
Yeah.
don't know, I don't know what's better or worse, to be honest. Like, I think that there's some grit that got built. And when we're talking about like generational patterns, generational traumas, like obviously those things need addressing.
Yeah.
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 Hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let's
Yeah.
talk about like, can we address, you mentioned intrusive thoughts. I think about like these this verse that we consider when we're diagnosing or like assessing our clients. Um, some things are really common, right? Like baby blues. How do we differentiate baby blues from an actual disorder?
Yeah. So baby blues are super common. 60 to 80% of new moms will experience baby blues. And they show up between 2 days and 2 weeks post-birth.
Hmm.
Um, so they will make you feel tired. They will make you weepy and have a rush of emotions, okay? Kind of that immediate experience post-birth.
Hmm.
A lot of women feel that.
Hmm.
Um, we will be concerned when 2 to 3 weeks after birth, women are still experiencing something.
Got
Okay.
it.
So 2 to 3 weeks, if your client is still coming in and they're expressing that they're having big emotions, that's when you want to start thinking about a perinatal mood or anxiety disorder. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, and what I would say is with this population, psychoeducation is key.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, the first thing to consider is intrusive thoughts. There is some really exciting research happening with the Perinatal Anxiety Research Lab out of the University of British Columbia. We've always known that a lot of moms experience intrusive thoughts. Well, their latest research is showing us that 100% of new moms experience intrusive, unwanted thoughts of harm coming to their baby, and about half of new moms are experiencing unwanted, intrusive thoughts of purposeful harm coming
Mm.
to the baby. That's stressful. And
Yeah.
but as stressful as that is, it's also normalizing. Okay. So
Hmm.
when we can share that with moms, that really helps. Typically, when I work with moms, the first thing I do is provide that psychoeducation around um, just how our brain works. Okay. And I'm supporting moms with understanding that intrusive thoughts are happening because of the stress response and the stress cycle.
Hmm.
Okay. When they can understand that this is evolution and hormones helping us respond in a way that keeps our babies safe, and this is normal, typically it provides that reassurance that new moms need. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, Unfortunately, postpartum intrusive thoughts takes new moms by surprise and stresses them out. Okay.
Hmm.
So they jump to a lot of conclusions. I don't know why, but algorithms seem to target new moms and immediately feed them with all the scary stories. They get their first
Hmm.
intrusive thought and think they're headed down to like the darkest, scariest experience possible.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, There's a really fabulous book called A Mom Like That by Aisha Elvey that for any therapist considering working in the postpartum perinatal space, I would highly recommend they pick that book up. It's a firsthand account from a woman who experienced postpartum psychosis, and she makes a really lovely point that you aren't more likely to get postpartum psychosis by being aware or educated about it. And
Hmm.
I really loved that point. I loved her making us aware of that. I think we understand that postpartum psychosis only affects 1 in 1,000 women, and of those 1 in 1,000, only 10% will go on to commit suicide or infanticide. Okay, so
Hmm.
it's really rare.
Yeah.
But I think because it's so rare, we tend to downplay it and say, you don't have to worry about that. Forget about
Hmm.
it. Okay. Instead, educating and helping women understand what it looks like and the differences between intrusive thoughts and OCD and postpartum psychosis can be really comforting and helpful to women to
Hmm.
understand that this is what you may want to understand. Postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, intrusive thoughts. As a therapist, these are the things you may want to be looking at
Hmm.
so that you can walk your clients through this experience.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I know for postpartum depression, one of the biggest risk factors is this is from my eating disorder work, right? Like a
Mhm.
previous history of an eating disorder sets you
Yeah.
up for very high risk or higher risk, I should say, of postpartum depression. Is that for PMADs across the board?
Yeah, certainly pre-existing conditions. If you've had a history, that is definitely a pre-existing condition that is definitely setting you up for a higher risk in the postpartum experience. Yes.
Hmm. So
Yeah.
for all of you, my fellow eating disorder therapists out there,
Hmm.
this is something that when my clients were getting pregnant, this is something I was always on the lookout for and would do some education around because, like you said, it's not going to make you have it, right? If you get educated about it. And I would always have because I don't know enough. And it's still like it was still too sensitive for me also to work with people, to consider working with people with like PMADs. It was still too tender inside. So I was
Hmm.
always ready with a referral because we have some really great practitioners here in town. And so if you work with folks with eating disorders or a history of depression or some of these risk factors and they get pregnant, I want you to be aware and having some conversations even before they have the baby
Mhm.
because and to have some referrals ready or somebody you're willing to consult with like weekly or bi-weekly if you decide you're going to support this person after they give birth if they struggle.
Yeah. So I really love when I get a chance to work with someone in the pre-birth stage. And what I would say to therapists is thinking about working with someone, if you choose to keep a client, if you have really great rapport with a client and you decide to keep them on as a postpartum client, because we know that the relationship is king in therapy, right? That's
Hmm.
the number, a primary indicator of success. And so that's great. Something to really consider is to treat the pregnancy or the um, the pregnancy experience as like a resourcing phase, okay?
Hmm.
And really encourage them to gather their people. And so, um, an integrated model of support would include healthcare workers, pharmacists, mental health services, social supports, caseworkers, home visitors, doulas, let's see, childbirth educators, um, putting together a birth plan, not just a birth plan, but a support plan, um, which might include chiropractors, lactation consultants, pelvic floor therapists, really any kind of resources that are going to set that client up for success
Hmm.
through the pregnancy experience, through the birthing experience, after they give birth. If you have a relationship with this client and you know that they've struggled with their mental health, that is an indicator that
Hmm.
they may be more likely to experience a postpartum mood or anxiety disorder. So do the work and help them gather those supports for their experience afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah. Can we talk about some of the factors that impact that postpartum period and our functioning and our mood and all of that?
Yeah, so I would say a lack of support is a huge one. Um,
Hmm.
Typically, when someone is coming in during that experience, if they've missed that opportunity to build those resources and they're just walking in for the first time, they've never seen a therapist, they've never, maybe they missed the opportunity to get uh, pregnancy support or prenatal care, and now for the first time they're seeking mental health support. Um, you're really in a triage position at that point.
Hmm.
Family history of mental health, um, personal history of mental health, lack of resources, um, really doing a good taking time to do a good social history. Um,
Yeah. I know for me, like one of the biggest factors is I had a lot of problems with breastfeeding.
mhm,
And I know that that can be correlated, like breastfeeding problems can be correlated with PMADs. I
mhm,
had it was not logical, you know. There's a lot of feelings, but it was as if something like formula didn't exist.
mhm,
Um, and to the point where it's like I don't even know if anybody mentioned formula, and I was not against formula. Like going into this, I was like, "Ah, we'll just get some formula if we need to." But something about my postpartum depression got all wrapped up in I can't feed my baby.
yeah,
And I had given birth actually like 45 minutes before one of our closest friends. And she had this oversupply of milk and I had this undersupply. And so she like the dads would like do this little we called it the Pony Express and they'd bring her extra milk to us, which was just like so beautiful and wonderful, but it also like maybe that kind of support reinforced that there were no other options that formula, like, honestly, it was like formula did not exist. Not that I
Yeah.
was against it. So it's interesting that like my brain just deleted this other option.
Yeah. Oh, Allison, I'm so sorry.
Oh.
There is a relationship between breastfeeding and postpartum depression.
Hmm.
And I really almost hate saying that because fed is best. And
Hmm.
there are all kinds of I don't know, implications around breastfeeding, like you're pointing out. There are cultural considerations around breastfeeding. There are so many um, different considerations around breastfeeding and really asking a lot of questions and talking to your clients and really understanding what are they thinking around breastfeeding because people bring in so many different um, assumptions and expectations and women put a lot of weight on their shoulders when it comes to breastfeeding. And so
Hmm.
like you are pointing out, I think your story is a really good one to mention on the show, and it's really typical. Honestly, women
Hmm.
put a lot of pressure on themselves. Um, and you're right, there is a correlation. There's something called dysphoric milk ejection reflex, where the hormone rush that you get when you breastfeed will cause women to feel like this rush of emotion, and that adds to the experience, right? Because every time they breastfeed, they're like experiencing this rush or this letdown of emotions, and that gets stressful.
Hmm.
Um, Depression, breastfeeding suppresses lactation. Depression can suppress lactation hormones, prolactin and oxytocin. So you have that
Hmm.
going on. Um, But yeah, we have all sorts of evidence-based risk factors. There's psychological risk factors, history of family, depression, anxiety, OCD, eating disorders, which you mentioned earlier, bipolar, PMADS, childhood sexual abuse, or trauma. There's biological risk factors like endocrine dysfunction, diabetes, thyroid imbalances,
Hmm.
um, fertility challenges if people struggle to get pregnant in the first place. Um,
Hmm. Oh, can we dive into that a little bit more? Because I
yeah.
know that's the case for so many of my friends who've,
Hmm.
most of my friends, I think we all waited kind of later than is
Yeah.
advised.
Yeah.
And so many of us struggled with
Yeah.
fertility issues.
Yeah.
And um, can you talk some about how fertility struggles can lead to, or not necessarily lead to, but are correlated with PMADs?
Well, sure, because it adds to big emotions around um, you know, when you have a baby, then all the expectations of how you're supposed to feel, right?
Hmm.
And if your feelings don't match what you think you're supposed to feel or how everybody else thinks you're supposed to feel, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that comes with that.
Hmm.
So, so you have, and childhood is hard, and feelings are never mutually exclusive.
Hmm.
And so women struggle with the idea that they have worked so hard for so long to finally have this baby that um, is maybe not exactly what they thought it was going to look like. And
Hmm.
they're struggling in ways that they did not expect to struggle, or, insert lots of complicated emotions here. And
Absolutely.
they feel guilty. They feel guilty for that. They feel guilty because they've made all these lovely friends in the various different groups
Hmm.
that they were in on the infertility journey, and they've left them behind. They had like it is there are so many layers
Hmm.
of feeling there that could be its own session, its own
Hmm.
um, training right there.
Yeah.
Um, so. I can't do it justice in a few short sentences, but yes, lots of
Yeah.
correlation there.
I
Um,
think too, like you'd mentioned support and how important that is earlier, and how, like, I think about a really good friend of mine who, when I got pregnant with my first, was just like, I'm really sorry. I just can't be around you. Like, I'm
yes,
so jealous.
yes,
And so like she had kind of had to, for self-preservation, cut out her friends who were starting to get pregnant. And
yeah,
then when she did get pregnant, eventually she felt like she was cut out of the infertility groups. So like
yes,
now she doesn't have these strong relationships that
yes,
she had had previously at a time that was incredibly hard.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Yes. And, part of being a postpartum perinatal therapist is that because I definitely work with women who are in that infertility, yeah, I hate the word journey. They're in that experience
Hmm.
where they are going through that process and um, might get pregnant and then have a loss. They have multiple
Hmm.
losses and riding those various different waves of excitement and loss and um, losing the friends and gaining friends and being on the various different sides of going to baby showers or
Hmm.
being invited to things. And there are so many complicated emotions in that realm.
Right.
Um, and it is very much part of this postpartum perinatal world. You
Hmm.
really can't separate it. Um, and it's important. It's an important area to be informed and thoughtful and conscious of. So,
Hmm. Yeah. I think about loss too.
mhm.
You'd mentioned, and how even if, let's say, somebody got pregnant on the first try
Yeah.
and then they have a loss or a series of losses, that roller coaster that you mentioned emotionally is so
Hmm.
tough.
Hmm.
Um, and so, also speaking from experience, because I had multiple losses in between my children, and being able to trust that final pregnancy with my now 9-year-old was really, really, really tough for me.
Yeah.
I had postpartum depression with the first one, and then all these losses, and I was really pretty sure like it wasn't safe to feel the excitement that I wanted to feel, and I'm also not good at like tamping down excitement, right? So I'm all in on everything I do, and then I get really disappointed or heartbroken if it doesn't work out the way I want. So
Yeah.
having gone through that with multiple pregnancies, and then being on edge the entire, like it wasn't like, oh, you're through the first trimester, you can trust now.
Tough.
I didn't trust
Tough.
until she was in my arms.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
100%. Um, I would also like to point out that postpartum mood and anxiety disorders can also happen to women who experience loss.
Yes.
And that sucks. Okay,
Hmm.
because now you have women who are being told they have postpartum anxiety or postpartum depression, and they don't even have the baby that is supposed to go with it.
Right.
And that is a special kind of hell, right?
Hmm.
Because you are walking through experiences with women who, that's a space to be in with clients. So
Yeah, absolutely. And people not understanding that grief.
yes,
I mean, miscarriages and pregnancy loss, so common, like
yes,
shockingly common.
shockingly.
Um, and a lot of people don't realize they're pregnant when they have a loss, like a early miscarriage or things like that. So maybe the number of people who are aware of it is smaller than the number of people who experience it. But it felt like, for me, the only people who really got it were the people who'd been through it. And
Mhm.
everybody else was kind of like, well, I mean, it's not like it wasn't a live baby, that kind of thing. And not knowing how to respond, not knowing how to like, does my grief count? Is this like, should I just move on and get over it and try again?
Yes,
When you've like put so much of your life and your hope and your dreams into this little baby
yes,
that never came to be.
right. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the piece, right? It's the hope and the dreams and the time and energy that you've just put into and you lose that, right?
Hmm.
Um, and you mourn that and there's grief there. So,
Yeah.
um, yes, yes. Um,
What about like adoption? Because I know
this,
that's a factor too.
that is a factor too. And uh, you are correct. Adoptive families can also experience that postpartum mood and anxiety disorder. Um, so don't think that just because a family didn't give birth that they are exempt from all of these challenges.
Hmm.
Back to the um, risk factors, we mentioned some of the evidence-based risk factors. There's psychosocial theories, including uh, feelings towards parenthood, one's relationship with their own parents. I would say institutional structural racism, vulnerability, the adoption or the structure of families. All of these things are things to be considered. And this is where clinical judgment comes in, right? We understand that as therapists, people's understanding, their perception of how their world is shaped will impact their mental health, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so risk factors, um, really taking a good biological and social history of your clients when they come in is important.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. And
yeah.
it seems like that would also include non-traditional families. Like, um, I think about like my good friend who had postpartum psychosis. She and her partner were both women,
Hmm.
and this was, so long ago. So it was just a harder time,
Hmm.
in some ways. It was before marriage was legal. It was even in states.
Hmm.
And so there was maybe more judgment, and it was more, we lived in a very liberal city, but it was still where they were from. People
Hmm.
didn't understand it. They go back to visit or talk to people back home, and it was just a totally different perception of like, are you sure you should be doing this?
Yes. Yeah,
Hmm.
I think really understanding access to care, um,
Hmm.
culturally appropriate care, where people are what's around and what people have for supports.
Hmm.
Back to that resourcing idea.
Hmm.
Um, and thinking about like what population or populations are people a part of and how does that impact their ability to get support? Where does this baby exist in the NICU for any amount of time?
Hmm.
Um,
Ooh, let's talk about the NICU for a little while because that's also such a huge factor.
It is.
Um,
It
yeah.
is. Yeah. Yeah. Teen parents, parents with disabilities themselves. You had mentioned your friend. Um, yeah, being in the NICU is a whole nother experience because your family is kind of required to stop while this baby is being cared for in the hospital, and it affects a parent's ability to work.
Hmm.
Um, you know, and exist on a day-to-day level, yet they are they are sitting there, their life is on hold. They're not
Hmm.
sure what's going to happen with this baby.
Yeah.
Um, so that's a whole another experience.
Hmm. And even if the prognosis is great and they're pretty
Mhm.
sure they're going to be able to bring this baby home in however many weeks, there's still that life on hold feeling. And
Mhm.
I know, like, I'm guessing that there is some overlap between traumatic birth and NICU babies. Is there a higher rate with one
Mhm.
another?
Yeah. And birth trauma, we haven't talked about that at all, but we should absolutely mention birth trauma today.
Mhm.
That's definitely something within the realm of PMADS, being aware of how birth trauma impacts women.
Mhm.
Birth trauma, it's easy to think about that with a NICU baby, a baby that has needs extra support post-birth.
Mhm.
Or a traumatic birth where mom is harmed or things don't go well during birth. Birth trauma can also impact the partner if they watch bad things happen. Mom
Mhm.
doesn't do well and maybe almost passes. Um, so don't forget about the partner when you're considering birth trauma.
Mhm.
But another thing to consider when it comes to birth trauma is women who have a hard time describing birth trauma because it's less obvious. And this can sometimes be women who felt like they weren't listened to
Mhm.
or that their autonomy was taken from them. Um, and a lot of times this is when baby's healthy. Okay.
Mhm.
So they had an experience where the medical professionals just took over, took control. They were their bodies felt violated, um, yet they ended up with a healthy baby. So what's the problem? Aren't you
Right.
lucky you have a healthy baby? Shut up.
Mhm.
Right. And now they feel so violated, they don't feel like they can ever have another baby. Um, but how do they even articulate that? Because even their partner or their mother or their best friend looks at them and says, "What's wrong? You have a healthy baby." Okay,
Mhm.
so they don't even know how to say that out loud, much less
Right.
and here they are dealing with like this inner trauma. Um,
Mhm.
so those are the kinds of things to like watch for as a therapist and ask a lot of questions around.
Mhm. Yeah, and to validate, because you might be the only person
Hmm.
or one of few people really validating their experience because there
Right,
is so much trust. And these are the experts. These people help people with birth every single day.
right,
And and sometimes what they do absolutely needed to happen, but it's still not the birth that you wanted and the
right,
birth that you'd like invested all your time and energy in expecting.
right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think about like, okay, we've got the NICU folks, we've got the birth trauma folks. You'd mentioned parents with disabilities. Can you talk
Mhm.
some about the impact there?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about any kind of special population, just think about how we start like scoping down with any kind of specialty service, right? Even within postpartum perinatal work, I consider myself a specialist in the world of PMADS. Okay. Well, within this experience, I'm working with women who also are deconstructing their faith, also belong to the LGBTQ community, also are women of color, also are executives, also are disabled in some way, shape, or form. Maybe all of those things, right?
Hmm.
And so the further we start funneling down on different populations, on different scopes, um, specialties become less and less and less. And so when you
Hmm.
are talking about someone who's disabled in any certain sort of way, and also may need support in the postpartum perinatal space, specialized services just become less and less and less, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so it's really important for those of us who are specializing to make sure we are considering um, all the various different populations. How can our services um, be accessible to people who might need specialized care, right?
Hmm.
Um, and what does that mean? How are parents with disabilities accessing care? Um, one of the things that's really interesting to me is I run a completely virtual practice, and um, in the postpartum perinatal space, that's a huge bonus because
Yeah.
moms don't want to drive.
Yeah. And trying to get out the house with a baby, like it's just so much work. It's so hard.
Right, but also if you're someone with a disability, That's also really nice to not have to go
Hmm.
anywhere.
Yeah.
Um, and um, but in a lot of spaces, for a lot of therapists, it's seen as a huge negative
Hmm.
because having a brick and mortar practice is important. But it's massively um, friendly to the disability community. Um,
Hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
so I guess I just would continue to advocate for always making sure that whatever you're doing with your practice is always considering what specialties, what different populations may need for
Hmm.
supports.
Yeah. So let's talk some about best practices for like assessment and treatment planning when you're working with clients with PMADs.
Mm-hmm.
Can we
Yeah,
start with screening?
yeah. So when we screen, a really common screener that we use in the postpartum space is the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale. And that's a free scale you can get online. It's available to anybody. Um, and that's really commonly used in by doctors' offices, by therapists. I would say it's a kind of gold standard scale. Um, the PHQ-9 or the GAD-7 would be others that I would recommend as common scales. Um, Screeners are just tools, you know,
Hmm.
use them often, especially in the postpartum, first first session every few weeks in that immediate postpartum experience. And then, monthly, um, as you're moving out just to watch progress. They're not a substitute for clinical judgment. We know that women of color are less likely to be screened. I think people expect that doctors are screening. That's kind of the assumption that doctors are screening for postpartum depression, but we also know that doctors don't consider themselves to be the experts or to be the most natural place to screen for postpartum depression. So there's a
Hmm.
disconnect there.
Hmm.
Um, we,
Yeah, I know I had screeners at both my like my appointment with my midwives and then again at the pediatrician. So they got me.
great. That's
Yeah, it was
fantastic.
wonderful. It did its job. But it's interesting because I just made the assumption like, oh yeah, this is what all the doctors are doing. But that doesn't mean they're actually scoring it or looking at it. It doesn't mean that they're feeling confident in referring.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Um, and and then taking a step past that, screeners are not the same as care,
Mhm.
right?
Right, right.
So to your point, are they referring? For instance, OCD is misdiagnosed around 70% of the time.
Hmm.
Um, and so once you're screened, are you being referred for care? Are people being referred for care? Is there enough care in the area? That's another whole conversation.
Hmm.
So I think major challenge of PMADS is how motherhood is presented in popular culture right now. You
Hmm.
know, motherhood, it's so easy to brush things off as like normal, and I put normal in air quotes, because the hot mess mom is just seen as kind of funny and and the thing,
Hmm.
and motherhood is supposed to be hard.
Hmm.
And that's what we're told. We're all told that motherhood is supposed to be hard. And so it's hard to walk into your pediatrician's office and when they say, "Are you doing okay?" And you are checking if your baby is breathing, every 5 minutes all night long, and you're exhausted because you're not sleeping. So many women think that's normal.
Hmm.
Um, and you're anxious because you don't want to leave the house just in case baby wakes up for a nap. So you haven't left the house in, 3 weeks.
Hmm.
Well, that feels normal to you.
Right.
There are all these situations that feel normal to new moms because motherhood is supposed to be hard. And having mental health practitioners that can help women articulate that, sure, you don't get as much sleep, and sure, baby interrupts your life and you have to take quicker showers, but you should still be able to perform most activities of daily living.
Hmm.
Um, that's important.
Yeah.
Okay. And really having a good grasp on how intrusive thoughts, when they are um, getting in the way and you are performing checks over an hour a day, well, that's when intrusive thoughts are are pushing into the area of OCD.
Hmm.
Um, and and when these things are preventing you from performing activities of daily living, that's when we're talking about something that's diagnosable.
Hmm.
Um,
I'm curious your thoughts. New technology comes out all the time for babies, right?
mhm.
And new parents. The technology that you put it underneath your baby and it'll alert you if the breathing is irregular in any way or
Yeah.
um I mean, even video monitors weren't a thing when I had my first, or maybe my
Yeah.
second. But what's your opinion on this extra monitoring? Is it more helpful for people? Is it more harmful?
It depends. And I know that's a horrible answer to give, but it really depends. And the answer is it depends because if moms can use it to support them and not give into the OCD piece of it, right?
Hmm.
Um, and if they're only using it to feed the intrusive thoughts, then no, that's not helping.
Hmm.
Okay. But if they truly use it in a way that provides them relief and support, great, use it. Awesome. I wish I would have had it.
How
But
does a clinician discern the difference?
so here's what and I talked to my moms about this, okay? An intrusive thought is a thought that is stressful. But when we think about an intrusive thought, and I do some psychoeducation and talk about the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. And I pull out some acceptance commitment therapy and like do the leaves on the stream
Hmm.
visualization with them. An intrusive thought is a thought that you should be able to notice and name and recognize as an intrusive thought. And once you name it, you should be able to watch it float on by.
Hmm.
Okay. If it is stressing you out and watching it float by really causes you distress and you cannot let it go. Okay. Um, and the letting it go, like my baby might have stopped breathing. I got to go check to make sure he's breathing. Okay. And that obsession and compulsion of checking on him breathing,
Hmm.
okay, is taking an hour a day, and you're doing that over an hour a day. That's when we're stepping into OCD territory.
Hmm.
Okay. Um, and so that's something I'm asking my clients to start naming, and we're talking about
Hmm. Yeah.
that. Okay, and then when intrusive thoughts start getting really violent, um, and scary, then I start asking a lot of questions. Um, and that's when we start exploring the psychosis.
Hmm.
Okay. Um, and that one's hard.
Yeah.
And I would say if you feel like you're venturing into that, again, I would, send you to that book, A Mom Like That by Aisha Elvey, um, because you're looking for delusions and hallucinations at that point,
Hmm.
um, which can be hard to discern between just scary, intrusive thoughts. Um, but I'm asking a lot of clarifying questions and just really listening to what
Hmm.
my client is telling me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And you mentioned actin there. What modalities are considered best practices?
yeah, so for intrusive thoughts, for postpartum depression, for postpartum anxiety, you know, sky's the limit. It's therapist choice.
Hmm.
Cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance commitment therapy, EMDR is really great, or brain spotting, accelerated resolution therapy. There's all sorts of options for those the those PMADs. Okay.
Hmm.
When we get into OCD, that perinatal anxiety research lab out of the University of British Columbia is saying that they like CBT for OCD. I have always been schooled in the thought that ERP was the gold standard for
Hmm.
OCD.
Yeah.
There's also something called ICBT, inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy,
Hmm.
which is just a kind of a slightly different take on CBT, actually quite different, um, for OCD. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, and when we start jumping into the psychosis space, that client needs to be hospitalized and medicated at that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. What's the role of medication with the other PMADs outside of psychosis?
I would highly encourage an OCD client to consider medication.
Mm.
Um, Postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, I really take that as on a case by case basis. That's something that you're building rapport with the client and talking to them about. The way I approach that is medication is a tool, and
Hmm.
I want to make sure our client feels like they have autonomy in the therapeutic space, and so I want them to know that that tool is available to them, and sure can help. But I also don't
Yeah.
want them. I'm an MSW. I'm an clinical social worker, so I don't want to feel like I'm pushing them towards medication. That
Right.
again is a therapist choice. I know other therapists might look at that differently. So
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. And so you had mentioned, like, in terms of strategies, maybe some, maybe not prevention, but like that pre-birth planning that you talked
yeah.
about. Um, what are the things that you cover in there so that when folks are you know, going off to have this baby, they
Mhm.
have these resources in their toolkit?
Yeah. So my gold standard, I love it when I get a chance to work with moms in the prenatal period.
Hmm.
That is the best case scenario. So if you have a client, that you're working with and they get pregnant and they want to keep working with you, amazing. Do that and help them start resourcing in that prenatal period. Gather their people, gather all the resources possible. Chiropractors, doulas, lactation consultants, pelvic floor therapists, pediatricians. The rule of thumb that I encourage moms to consider is if you don't listen to somebody's advice now before you had a baby, do not listen to their advice after you have a baby.
Love
Um,
that.
yeah,
Hmm.
right, right. And like think about that because
Hmm.
in the postpartum experience, they will be tempted to listen to their you know, ridiculous Aunt Debbie. But if you're
Hmm.
not listening to her now, we're not going to do that, right?
Right.
Um, and so really talking them through all the things that they can do to set themselves up for success.
Hmm.
Is that meal planning and putting meals in the freezer and getting themselves ready to go? Is that thinking about what their boundaries are going to look like? Is that talking to their partner about what their boundaries are going to look like?
Hmm.
That they're on the same
Yeah.
page, right?
Yeah.
Um, and chances are, if you're working with a client beforehand, you probably already know the themes of the things that client is working on,
Hmm.
and you can extend those themes into planning for postpartum. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. I know I
When,
had, like, before I gave birth to my second, having gone through it, postpartum depression with my first, I went to like one of my students here who was a PMAD therapist, and I was like, I need the names of some therapists I don't know who do
yeah,
this. I
yeah,
need like a list of lactation consultants and
yeah,
what was it that had really helped back in Seattle because I'd moved between my kids. Um, but I saw a therapist back with my first child, after my first child was born, and then cranial sacral therapy. also helped.
Yeah.
Some of the like jaw stuff in my daughter, and at one point the cranial sacral therapist was like, "I'm more concerned about you than your daughter. Do you want to get on
Uh-huh.
this table?" And I was like,
Yeah.
"Okay."
Yep.
Um, and so I had my list of like, here are my resources if things go sideways. I bought a bunch of formula so that it would be
Yeah.
in the cupboard,
Yeah.
and didn't end up having any of the
Yeah.
PMADs, which was great. But I had formula to back me up, which I needed.
Yeah.
Used it with abandon, and just it was a different experience. And I do think that it was in some way preventative to have a plan going in.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. It's preventative.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and anytime you can, somebody who's going in for their second, knowing what happened with the first,
Hmm.
plan for everything that went wrong with the first.
Yeah,
Make that plan.
yeah,
I love that. I love that you did that for yourself.
yeah,
So,
it was good.
mhm,
And
mhm.
what about like short-term strategies versus like longer-term solutions? Because I know sometimes things require a band-aid,
Yes.
even though it's not going to last. But how do you help folks with that?
Yeah, so when people come in and they haven't had that opportunity to do all that pre-planning and you're in more of a triage state, it
Hmm.
really is typically an opportunity for psychoeducation. And it really is
Hmm.
working with women to understand and what's going on in their brains, how their body's responding, um, and why it's responding in the way that it is, right?
Hmm.
So it's that triage experience of how do we get you support right now? How do we get you through this? What's happening right now and feeling better? Okay.
Hmm.
In the short term. Once we stabilize, that's when we start to get into the good work of therapy and work on longer term skills. Um,
Hmm.
and that always feels a lot better. And again, depending on what they present with, that's when you get to dig into the acceptance commitment therapy or the EMDR or the ERP, depending on
Hmm.
what they present with.
Got
So
it. Yeah.
yeah.
And so for therapists who are like, I'm really intrigued by this, I want to be more knowledgeable, or I want to niche to this
Mhm.
population. What would you suggest for them?
Yeah, so the postpartum support international would be the primary group that trains and certifies for people who want to specialize. And they
Hmm.
have a 2-year certification called the Perinatal Mental Health Certification, so PMH-Cs. And it's a multidisciplinary certification. So mental health therapists can become PMH-Cs, but so can other disciplines. Um, there are a couple different trainings. There's a 2-day training and then a 1-day advanced training that you can take through Postpartum Support International. And their website is postpartum.net. Um, and then you practice within this population for 2 years and you take a test. And it's similar to a licensure exam, although it's not nearly as hard as the um, various different clinical licensure exams that we all take.
Hmm.
Um, and then forever thereafter, we submit CEUs in this
Right.
particular area. Um,
Hmm.
and so I would highly recommend that for anybody who's interested in niching down in this space.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
but
interesting because often I see certifications as kind of like a cash grab. Like I
yeah,
let go of my eating disorder certification because I was
yeah,
like, this is just, but with the perinatal population,
yeah,
I have seen over years and years, like this is a group where people want to refer to the people who are certified or working towards certification.
yeah,
Like it seems like a very valuable one, and it imbues a lot of trust
yeah,
for working with a population that a lot of people really don't have a lot of business working with if they haven't done some
yeah.
solid education.
I would say this is a group that really works hard to make sure we know what we're doing. The
Mhm.
conference is really great every year. The continuing education and the work that this this group of folks put into making sure that we're on the front end of research and understanding in order to do the best for this population.
Mhm.
Um, I would agree with that.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, it's a good group to be a part of. Um, yeah, yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
Well, Anne, thank you so much for educating us. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you really want people to walk away from this CE knowing? Or did we nail it?
Do you feel like you got what you needed out of this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll
okay.
end the recording there then.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. This was fantastic.
Absolutely. I hope that broadened your clinical horizons. Head over to notboringces.com to get your CE credit. Want to have a not boring conversation with me about your clinical area of expertise? You can apply there too. If you like this conversation, leave us a 5-star review, tell a friend, and be sure to subscribe for future conversations.